Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today we're talking with Professor Tamara Walker. She is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Toronto. Professor Walker, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Thanks for coming on. Today we're going to be talking about her recent book, Exquisite Slaves, Race, Clothing, and Status in Colonial Lima. That's out of the Cambridge University Press. Before we get into the book itself, we always ask scholars, what first got you interested in history?
What first got me interested in history? I actually went to college expecting to major in Spanish. And so I knew that I wanted to kind of study abroad in a Spanish-speaking country. I'd really loved all my Spanish classes in high school and wanted to continue that. And so I didn't really have a plan for studying history, but it happened that I studied abroad my junior year in college in Argentina. And I did it with a program that allowed us to undertake these independent research projects. And I ended up doing this project that was focused on multicultural education in a place like Argentina. And I realized how important it was to have an understanding of the region's history of slavery, of immigration, and so on. And so the more I got into this project, the more I got into the subject of history. And so when I got back to college, it was all I could think about. And I ended up being part of this program. At the time, it was called the Mellon Minority Undergraduate Fellowship Program. Now it's called the Mellon Mays University Fellowship Program. But the idea behind it is the same. It was all about increasing the diversity of faculty at colleges and universities around the country. And part of that project involved helping prepare these undergraduates for applying to grad school and succeeding in grad school. And so they helped us do independent research projects and, just think about having careers in academia. So when I came back from Argentina, I just wanted to keep going with this study of basically race and identity in Latin America. And so one thing sort of led to another. I guess it's a separate question of how I ended up going from studying modern Argentina to colonial Peru, but the seed was there just from having that experience abroad.
If you're willing, what did bring you to Colonial Lima?
So I got to grad school. I went to the University of Michigan for grad school, and after our first year, we were planning to spend summers doing exploratory dissertation research. And once again, I went back to Argentina because I had this vision of working on something related to race and nation in modern Argentina. And I just kept running into roadblocks around people wanting to talk about race. Things are a lot different now from what I've read and gathered from people I've spoken to, but back then it was just a difficult topic to undertake. And so I remember coming back and talking to my advisor, Rebecca Scott, in graduate school about that difficulty. And one of the things she had said is that, sometimes it can be more productive to go back to a point in time when these populations that you're interested in, and in my case, African descent populations, are indisputably present because they have been recorded and documented in really precise ways. And that time period is the colonial period when people of African descent were property, among other things. But because of their status as property, they were carefully documented. And so that kind of made the light bulb go off and made me think about moving back in time. And then it happened that, life often helps to shape these things. And back when I was in college and planning to go to Argentina, I was waiting to get the program started because their semesters were different than the U.S. semesters. So classes weren't starting until March, and I had from January to March to be at home in Colorado, where I'm from, and try to make some money. And I was working at a Peruvian restaurant. And the whole time I was at this Peruvian restaurant, they were wondering why on earth I was going to Argentina. Wasn't there a more interesting place like Peru that I could be going to? And it just planted the seed of interest in Peru. So it was kind of a confluence of things that were happening in my life and in my education that made the history of slavery and somehow Peru come together as this place that I wanted to spend more time kind of studying and exploring. And so that became the sort of way into the history of slavery in Peru.
Perfect. Now, your book, Exquisite Slaves, looks at clothing as an object of study. That's probably outside of what, at least a lot of mainstream history, which is much more political history oriented, based on archival documents of like the State Department, or military history, looking at guns and stuff. Clothing is not as it's definitely like a respected field of study, but it's not as it hasn't really penetrated into a lot of the mainstream outside of academia. What can you tell us about the origins of this kind of approach to the past, and how you approach clothing as an object of study?
Sure. Well, I would say that on one hand, yes, it's a relatively distinct topic, but fundamentally the book is about slavery in Peru. And the way I came to this project was, again, in graduate school, I had taken a class in the English department that allowed us to spend some time in the Clements Library at the University of Michigan. It's a rare books library there. And I happened upon this travel account that was written by a woman named Ida Pfeiffer, who had taken this solo journey around the world in the 19th century. She gets to Peru a few years after the abolition of slavery, and one of the things that she ends up remarking upon is how the so-called milk and fruit women, she called them, with their yellow and dark brown faces, were outfitted in finery, and she was so struck by it. She was also very disparaging in her characterizations of these women. She said that they looked like pigs with gold necklaces, and in that moment, I was struck, one, by the finery they were wearing. They were wearing silk and gold and shawls, and I was curious about kind of how it was that they came into possession of these objects. And then I was also struck by how Pfeiffer described them, just in such a disparaging way, because there seemed to be a gap between how the women saw themselves and were carrying themselves, and how this British woman who was encountering them for the first time described them. And so that's where the interest in clothing came from, this kind of moment of, one, this group of women thinking of themselves with a fair amount of pride, I imagined, and on the other hand, this outsider perceiving them in such a dismissive and disparaging way. And so it struck me as an interesting way to get at how a population, and in particular a population of enslaved people or recently freed people, given that this was shortly after abolition, would use clothing to convey their own sense of self and identity and status and self-regard, and how people would react to that. And so that became the seed of a dissertation that ended up just exploring these questions more broadly and their implications for a slaveholding society that had a very specific way of thinking about and ordering people of African descent within the social hierarchy.
And I mean, I'm sure that that we'll probably get into this during the rest of the podcast, but would the restrictions on the expression, the use of clothing, there were also older restrictions, I think, going back to earlier centuries, on how people of different castes and classes could dress, right? So this is kind of an offshoot of like a particular field within that, right?
Mm-hmm. So do you mean within Peru specifically, or just more generally within hierarchical societies?
Hierarchical societies, like the how people were, the restrictions on how you could dress and express yourself through your clothing and other objects was kind of, it's an older issue, right? Or older phenomenon. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, so there's a long tradition of sumptuary legislation in various parts of the world. I think wherever there is a hierarchical society, there's a set of laws governing who at different ranks on that hierarchy can wear or own or carry certain things. And so some sumptuary laws are focused primarily on weapons and keeping members of the lower classes from carrying weapons that would be the domain of people of higher classes. And then there are also laws that would be kind of gender specific around clothing, or even accessories like jewelry, that would restrict whether women of certain classes could wear pearls or gold or other kind of high status jewelry items, or silk or shawls. And this is true in medieval Europe, in societies that were relatively homogenous in terms of race or ethnicity that would nonetheless have class distinctions. And likewise in Peru and other parts of Latin America, there was a tradition of sumptuary law that restricted the access that people of African, indigenous, and mixed racial ancestry could have access to. And this kind of legislative trend or tradition appears throughout my book, which spans from the early 18th to the middle of the 19th century. And from very early on, there's this kind of emphasis on legislating behavior. And to me, what was so interesting is that the repetition of these laws told me that people were disregarding them. And that's something that is true in various societies with sumptuary legislation. They're there, but they're always disregarded in so many ways. But what was interesting to me in the context of Peru was that they're being disregarded not only by the targets of those laws, but by the people who the laws are meant to protect or elevate, meaning Spaniards, elite Spaniards especially. And what I was finding was that there was an investment on part of elite Spaniards in outfitting their human property, their African slaves, in finery as a way of signaling their own wealth and status and prestige. And so there was this kind of constant dance between state and society over clothing. And the sumptuary laws were one way into seeing that and to getting a sense of why clothing mattered so much to so many people.
Interesting. I haven't. This isn't my personal field, but I have been made at least vaguely aware of this phenomenon through Alejandro Lafuente's book on the 16th century in Havana, where he mentions in passing how the Cabildo, the town council of Havana in the 16th century, was trying to regulate the clothing of people of African descent in the Cabildo that early, which struck me as kind of shocking, because I always expected many of those regulations to be of a later phenomenon, but apparently it started quite early. Now, before we delve into the meat of the book, what kind of methodology did you have to develop to study this topic? What kind of source issues did you come across? Because an archival document, they're going to put it in an archive and hopefully it should survive, but clothing is probably going to deteriorate much more easily and it's going to be a lot harder for it to survive. What kind of issues did you come across?
Yeah, so I wasn't looking for clothing kind of remnants per se, or clothing from an archaeological perspective. To me, what was so interesting were all these kind of fights and disputes and attitudes around clothing. So even going back to that travel account that I mentioned, to me, what was so interesting was the perspective of this woman who was taking in these women in elegant clothing and being really kind of shocked by the sight of them. And so that to me was really compelling, kind of the tension between how people saw themselves and how other people saw them. And then likewise with sumptuary laws, the tension between how colonial officials envisioned their society to function and how colonial subjects saw it functioning themselves, including elite Spaniards and enslaved populations. And so those were some of the types of sources that I was starting to kind of gather over the course of, putting together a dissertation proposal and moving into the dissertation research, looking at more travel accounts of visits to Peru. Peru happened to be a place that was kind of heavily trafficked by European visitors, because it was the capital. Lima was the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru, which was an important administrative center in Spanish America, one of the two most important ones, the second one being New Spain, or what's now Mexico. These were places that were tremendous engines of wealth, tremendous sites of political power, and really appealing destinations for some of Spain's imperial rivals, and even Spaniards themselves, who wanted to kind of take in these landscapes and their kind of diverse features and the populations that were contained therein. So there was a lot to work from in terms of those travel accounts. And what I noticed to be a theme was kind of how they remarked upon the clothing of Lima's inhabitants. And that went from everyday, practices and customs, the kinds of things that people were wearing, and also the kind of ceremonial attire people would don. Lima was a place, because of its status as capital of the Viceroyalty, where there was a really active ceremonial life in honor of births, deaths, coronations, all kinds of kind of royal life cycle events in Spain. They would all reverberate in Lima. And so there was a lot going on in the realm of ceremonial life, and there was a lot going on in the way that people put themselves and their human property on display in those settings. And so those were really useful sources to me and interesting sources to me. And then so were sumptuary laws. But what I was also trying to get at, beyond kind of how outsiders viewed slaves and people of African descent and even indigenous and mixed racial populations, was how these groups saw themselves. And so what I ended up finding, I think not intentionally, it just sort of happened to stumble in the archives in Peru upon a criminal case. The first one I found was a criminal case involving an enslaved woman who was accused of stealing from her owner's friend several clothing items, and she was accused of kind of absconding with these clothing items and giving them to other people in her life. And to me, that just opened up this whole world of kind of activity and possibility in terms of how it was even possible for an enslaved person who didn't so much as kind of own their own movements and output, was able to gain access to clothing and kind of what they were doing with it in the first place. And so I started to look into criminal records as another kind of source space for a project about everyone's relationship to and ideas about clothing. And so it's interesting because when I started this work, there were, now it's a different moment in the field of studies of slavery in Latin America in general and in Peru in particular. But at the time, there were a small handful of texts on the subject. And I remember in one of them, there was this reference to there being kind of a mound of documentation when it came to detailing the place of slaves in Peruvian society in terms of the various kind of aspects of daily life they touched, from ecclesiastical to civil. And I found the opposite to be true when it came to thinking about their relationship to material goods and to their own bodies and identities. And so it meant that I was, rather than dealing with this sort of mound of documentation across different kind of sources, instead I was kind of piecing together fragments and kind of trying to creatively read those fragments together. So that's where I was kind of looking at travel accounts, looking at sumptuary laws, looking at criminal cases, looking at runaway notices to the degree that some of those were available, mostly for my later time period. But that was kind of the approach I took, just kind of looking under every rock, as it were, for some window onto the subject of clothing. And I say all that to say that I hadn't really gone into the dissertation with a concrete argument, or even a concrete narrative in mind. I was really just like, there's something going on here with clothing. It keeps coming up in weird ways. People seem really frustrated about it or really intrigued about it. And I just want to know what's going on here. And so at that point, I was just trying to gather as much material as possible that had to do with slavery and clothing, not kind of these things separately, but slavery and clothing, or race and clothing. And that's what kind of sent me down these various kind of rabbit holes of sources that I then started to put together with a clearer picture of what was happening. And what was happening, in part at least, was that you have these people who were defined as property, who understood their status as property, but who also understood themselves to be human beings with social relationships all their own outside of their relationships with their owners. They were mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters. And for them, because they didn't have a claim over their freedom and their daily lives and movements, clothing was a way for them to establish some sense of individuality, or to show some sense of regard for the people in their lives. There were sort of gendered dimensions to that, with enslaved men often stealing clothing in order to distribute to their loved ones, often the women in their lives, to act in certain ways as patriarchs or heads of household, even if they didn't live in the same households with their families. And likewise for women, there was a way in which clothing for them allowed them to claim a sense of femininity that they were denied under slavery, which kind of forced a sense of androgyny on them, or over-sexualized them in other ways. And with clothing that they were either stealing or purchasing or being gifted by the people in their lives, they were able to claim a sense of femininity through certain elegant dresses, or shoes, or accessories that allowed them to step outside of the identity that had been assigned them at birth and claim something a little different. So that's what was kind of starting to emerge as a narrative from these bits and pieces of data that I was gathering over the course of working on the dissertation and later on the book.
And out of curiosity, you mentioned that some of the clothing is stolen, some of it is purchased, some of it is obtained by other means. But in terms of the exact clothing used, are we talking about style, like basically the reproduction of the styles of existing colonial elites, whether they be of a middle or higher classes kind of thing? Or are we talking about both the co-optation of certain symbols, be it, for example, pearls or something, or silks, along with, for example, a subversion of the style in some way that expresses some kind of African traditions or difference, as well as like not just the co-optation of these symbols, but also a subversion of the styles? I'm just curious because I don't know.
Yeah, well, I would say there's kind of a spectrum. So if you go back to the examples of slaveholders who were outfitting their slaves in ways that would showcase their own status, there was very much a preoccupation among these elite slaveholders of having their slaves kind of dress as avatars of themselves. And so they would replicate some of the lace shawls that were worn by elite Spanish women, or there was a costume in Peru known as a saya y manto, and it was basically a long, sometimes fitted, sometimes full skirt, depending on the time period, and a shawl that was known to cover everything but the wearer's left eye. And so often you would see enslaved women wearing versions of this costume themselves. And so there was, on that end of the spectrum, a certain pattern of emulation. And then there was also, I mean, outside of stealing clothing, there was also the fact that for a lot of slaveholders, when they were writing their wills, they were often granting freedom to their slaves. And this was especially true in the case of female slaveholders. With their female slaves, they would also bequeath them certain clothing items as an expression of gratitude or some complicated kind of mix of dynamics that define the experience of slaveholding and enslavement. And then you would have enslaved women or freed women wearing these clothing items that had been bequeathed to them. But then on the other end of the spectrum, there were examples of different types of kind of sartorial innovation among enslaved and free people of African descent. And it was difficult to sort of pin this down in the documentation, and instead it was visible in some of these kind of derisive characterizations of the way they would dress. There in the Ida Pfeiffer account that I keep referring to, she had, described these women as looking like pigs with gold necklaces, but she also described their clothing as kind of hanging half off and just kind of looking a bit askew. And you could read that as, them just not knowing how to, properly wear these clothing items, or trying to kind of sexualize clothing items by kind of pulling a dress or a top kind of off their shoulders. But you might also think of it as them adapting a particular way intentionally of wearing the clothing items that more suited their own aesthetics and conventions. again, that's more difficult to pin down in the documentation, but that is something I considered in my analysis. And then you have, in the realm of visual culture, some further evidence that there were different aesthetic conventions involved. I talked towards the end of the book about this self-taught watercolorist named Pancho Fierro, who himself had been born into slavery and had been given his freedom. And so much of the attention he pays to Lima's urban landscape is to people of African descent. He is doing his work both before abolition and shortly thereafter, and he's depicting people in costumes that suggest a different way of pairing clothing items together or of adorning themselves. Lots of women in hats and people, belting things in specific ways. So there was a spectrum of emulation and of innovation, and I try to kind of walk the readers through that and where I see it and why I see it that way in the book.
For sure, and of course we do have the issue of so much of this is being mediated by people who, even if these things were obvious to the people who are using the clothing in that way, because it's mediated by colonialist perspectives that can be lost. And out of curiosity, Lima has the presence of people of African descent, but it also had the presence of a lot of indigenous people. Is there any kind of influence or overlap between, for example, how many indigenous people who are also often in more like subjective, subservient positions, influenced how people of African descent were using the clothing? I mean, is there any kind of relationship or overlap there?
Well, and this is where I go back to the idea that the book is about clothing, but it's also about slavery and it's about social relationships, because I think so often within the study of Latin American history, there is a tendency to kind of talk about relationships between Spaniards and Indians on one hand, and relationships between Spaniards and Africans on the other. And what often gets left out are the relationships between Africans and indigenous populations. And these were obviously populations that came into regular contact with one another. They had children together. These were populations that were as visible in the colonial context as any other kind of racial mix. I'm referring to the so-called Sambos, the children of indigenous and African descent populations. And so I do in the book signal those kind of relationships and interactions. It's a little more difficult to pin down how those relationships kind of played out in the realm of style and, sartorial innovation. But certainly these were groups that came into contact with one another, that either kind of distributed material resources between one another or stole from one another. I mean, these were complicated relationships that took on various forms. But beyond kind of how people dressed, I was interested in why clothing mattered to them and how it shaped their relationships with one another and their own ability to kind of create identities for themselves, social identities, familial identities. And so that's where I talk about the relationships between indigenous and African descent people, less having to do with what the clothing may have looked like and more having to do with what it meant to them to have these sorts of clothing items.
Right. I mean, did Lima at the time also have a significant free population of color, or?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's and so that's what's interesting, because the free population of color increases over the course of the 18th century, but there's a significant population of free people of African descent, of indigenous ancestry, and of mixed racial ancestry. And to me, what was also interesting is the fact that these are all groups that have tremendous daily contact with the enslaved population. It's easy to think about the slaves in Lima as really only having contact with their owners when it comes to contact with free people. But what was so interesting to me and surprising to me as I kind of started this work was how many slaves, for example, lived outside of their owners' homes, and instead either lived with family members or with other kind of social intimates or other slaves, or free people. And so there would be all of this kind of social intercourse across legal status. And that I bring up in the book to signal all the kind of routes that enslaved people were able to travel to gain access to material goods and to kind of distribute or be on the receiving end of distributions of material goods. And so it's a city that has a sizable free population, and that had tremendous implications for the experiences of enslaved people. Even a family could have people living, as I call it, on both sides of the law, with some being enslaved and some being free. And this would have a profound impact on every member of the family, to have people living under slavery or to have people who had access to freedom and all that entailed.
Yeah, I keep thinking about how in Cuba you had like obviously, for example, in Havana, a large enslaved population, but also a large population that was free and which used symbolic the marches as part of the Batallones de Pardo y Morenos, who used uniforms and different things to signal that their free status, that they were men, that they were to be respected, and social status. So it's interesting that that, because I hadn't actually read much about Lima's own how this played out in Lima's situation in the colonial era. So now you've touched upon some of these sumptuary laws. Would you mind explaining a little bit more in detail? Would they mostly come through the cabildo in the case of Lima, or did Lima have a cabildo? Or
it did. It did.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or were they at the viceroyalty level? How did that work?
Both, and it just kind of varied according to different kind of historical moments. There was a really significant one that was passed by the Viceroy in 1723, and that's kind of what I used to open the book, that makes reference, it was passed in 1725, but it makes reference to a previous order that had been passed in 1723. And one of the reasons that the 1725 law kind of needs to be reissued was because of how immediately and egregiously the 1723 order had been violated. And it kind of calls out the source of that violation. They mentioned that one of the judges in the Real Audiencia of Lima had been responsible for the order having been violated within 24 hours of its publication, the 1723 order. And so I talk in the book about kind of what was going on there, because it only says that. It only kind of name checks this judge and says that 2 slaves belonging to him had been responsible for violating the order. And so that's where I start to kind of unpack this question of who is keeping these sumptuary laws from doing their job. In part, it's the slaves because they're being named here, but in part, it's their owners because it's his status as a judge that most likely made him inclined to outfit his slaves in finery that would convey his own status. But it also is what kind of protected the enslaved women from facing any sort of punitive measures for having violated the law. And so that right there, this kind of viceregal decree is capturing kind of at a local level what's keeping these orders that are coming down from on high from having any kind of measurable impact on the day-to-day reality in the city.
It's interesting that you mentioned that it was decided at a viceroyalty level as well, because this is not just the local elites who are angry that there is a subversion of the situation within the city limits. This is something that has been elevated to the level of the viceroyalty, which is, that in and of itself is kind of an expression of its significance, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that sort of weaves in with the attention that's being paid by these visitors to Lima, that everyone has something to say about the way not only elites are dressing, but the way even down to enslaved people and lowly kind of artisans. Jorge Juan and Antonio de Ulloa, the Spanish chroniclers who arrive in Lima in the 18th century, are remarking upon this as well. So it's a region that has this kind of enduring and widespread reputation for the sumptuous displays of its inhabitants across status and across kind of legal distinctions. And as you mentioned, it's quite a phenomenon. It's quite a problem as well.
And it really kind of seems to imply that this is very much to be understood as a part of the reproduction of the social order in and of itself. The clothing and status as not just signifiers, but also kind of like it's also. The violation of the social order in that regard seems to be like an implicit kind of threat in and of itself.
Right, absolutely. And it's interesting, and I talk about this in the book as well. This is a place that has a tremendously diverse population and a large and growing population of racially mixed individuals. And so you can't tell by looking at someone's skin color where they fit on the hierarchy. And so absent those sorts of defining kind of characteristics, as you might imagine in the U.S. context or even in certain other regional contexts, here clothing really does a lot of that work. And it's precisely because it's so difficult to determine on the basis of phenotype who belongs where in the hierarchy that clothing matters so much, and why clothing can be such a destabilizing force in that kind of context as well.
Oh, that's really interesting, because like many of our listeners, because this is done in English, many of our listeners are from the Anglophone world. There's a lot of familiarity with the kind of the way race often works in, for example, the U.S., where it's much more. At least in theory, like if someone is even part black, they are black. They cease to be white. But in Latin America, and especially in certain regions, in Lima, race is a lot more malleable, and it is a lot more, my understanding, for example, for indigenous people, it is if you assume Spanish language and culture, you're not white, but there's a lot more gray in terms of how race, and basically different dynamics for how race works. So I hadn't even thought about how that makes clothing even more central to it.
Right, and there's a term in the Spanish-American context, calidad, which kind of loosely translates in English to quality, but it's the thing that captures all of this. Not just ancestry, not just status, but also kind of self-presentation and clothing. And so these were all parts of how people identified, and therefore they were all things that mattered quite a lot in terms of how people position themselves in society. And it was therefore the need to kind of jealously police those boundaries that created so many conflicts. But within that was also this desire among elite Spaniards to enlist their human property in these displays, right? As much of their status as elites depended on that ability. It's not just, their ability to claim, pure European ancestry and all these other things, old Christian blood, etc. That what they're also claiming as part of their status was that ability to exercise dominion over human property and to enlist them in their displays of status. And obviously that created a lot of tensions, especially among middling Spaniards who didn't quite have the same access to those sorts of displays, but nonetheless wanted to claim a sense of status themselves. So it's a complex set of dynamics that are made even more complicated by the tremendous diversity of this population and the wealth of this city that made access to luxury even possible. And
you mentioned how they name check the judge in one of those in the 1725 Viceroyalty order, I think you said, and you have all these issues. They have to keep reissuing it because it keeps getting ignored. How did enforcement work? Are we seeing a situation where there was, there was a very active risk that someone would be like, what would the punishment be? How actively was it actually enforced?
Yeah, no, and that gets to the heart of it, because from all evidence, there seemed to have been no real kind of legal enforcement. There were threats of bodily punishment or of confiscation of human property if owners were found culpable. Slaves would be threatened with lashings. The 1725 order stands out because it is so explicit in its punitive measures. It would also seek to punish any tailors who were found making clothing for slaves or free people of mixed racial ancestry. And so it was really far-reaching in its attempt to penalize any violations whatsoever. And so the first place I'm looking is in these criminal records. That's how I actually found the criminal case that I mentioned when I first started this project, because I had found the sumptuary law and I was looking for evidence of people having been punished for violating it, and there's no evidence of that. And so you see there's this tension between kind of the rhetoric of the law and its actual application. That doesn't mean that this is just a context of kind of unfettered access to clothing, because the other thing I talk about in the book is how subject enslaved people are, and even free people of African descent are, to scrutiny and surveillance. And there's so many examples of people being accused of stealing precisely because a slave, quote, could not afford such finery. And so there were these presumptions that were kind of influenced by sumptuary law, that here's the law, here's the hierarchy, here's how everyone should fit within it, that would make people say, well, therefore, if I see an enslaved person with elegant clothing, they shouldn't have it, they must have stolen it, they're in violation somehow. So it meant that these people were under tremendous scrutiny day in and day out, and that's something that they had to carry with them for all that they were trying to convey their own sense of honor and status and dignity. They're also having to deal with people, third parties, people in their orbit, other slaves even, kind of questioning how and why they are dressing in certain ways or dressing their family members in certain ways. So that the weight of scrutiny and the weight of surveillance is something that's very profound in this context.
I mean, it sounds like a kind of expression of weakness on the part of the state, that they had to keep reissuing it and keep making it more and more draconian in terms of punishments, because not only are they saying this is important, they're saying that they are largely, it seems to imply that they're largely impotent to control it, because, I mean, if it was, the punishments wouldn't be as harsh.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it just speaks to the power of clothing, right? It's easy to think about clothing as this sort of kind of unimportant or frivolous thing that, I mean, certainly there's a sense of that in the realm of academia, but even in the context that we study, it wasn't frivolous, right? If it were, then there wouldn't need to be this constant repetition and reissuing of sumptuary laws and this assertion of hierarchy on the basis of clothing. And yet here it is, and here's this constant violation and this constant preoccupation on part of colonial subjects across the kind of social and economic spectrum with clothing.
I mean, even though obviously the context is very different, even today, clothing is an extremely important signifier, even if we're not aware of it always. So out of curiosity, your book focuses on obviously Colonial Lima, but so I imagine that you didn't take this very deeply into independence, but do you know to what degree independence radically changed any of these dynamics, if at all?
Well, so the book ends, the epilogue kind of takes us a couple years after abolition, and it takes us to this publication that came out in 1858 called El Negro. And the reason I focus on it is because I wanted to continue the thread of kind of scrutiny and surveillance as being a legacy of these colonial processes and practices, because even as they gained freedom, even as they gained citizenship, enslaved people are still being targeted derisively for the way they dressed. And the publication that I talk about in the conclusion is a really compelling and devastating example of that, where slaves are not only being made fun of, or not slaves, I'm sorry, freed blacks are being made fun of for improperly wearing petticoats and having things on askew, all the same things that came up in the travel account that kind of opened my eyes to this world. And everything they do is just somehow off, somehow wrong, somehow inappropriate. And that's kind of this is a satirical publication that kind of takes aim at them in different ways, either in descriptions of a scene of a promenade or in a kind of short one-act play that also makes fun of how African descent women are dressing and comporting themselves, thinking that they're ladies when by no means are they, or making fun of how they talk. So then clothing, in addition to overall self-presentation and even manners of speech, become targets of derision in the Republican era. And so that's kind of where I see the story kind of coming to a close and signaling something bigger that's happening in the 19th century around taking aim at African descent people's claims to citizenship and humanity in ways that then open up the possibility of talking about a place like Peru alongside a place like the US, because there's such a tendency, and there's long been a tendency in the scholarship, to think of these places as having different institutions of slavery for one thing, and certainly different post-abolition dynamics for another. Frank Tannenbaum was someone who had really kind of laid this out for us, that the post-abolition kind of world in Latin America was very different from the US. And in some ways that's absolutely true. There was no Jim Crow style segregation in the Latin American context in the way that there was in the US context. But what I'm kind of getting at in the conclusion of the book, or the epilogue to the book, is that there are more parallels than there are divergences. And this publication, El Negro, really emblematizes that, because it borrows very explicitly from 19th century print culture in the US that was also taking aim at Black people and their pretensions to citizenship and belonging, the abolition broadsides of the 19th century that were making fun at their grip on freedom and its discourses and discourses of citizenship. And other aspects of this publication are borrowing very directly from U.S. print culture in the 19th century. And so I kind of use that to signal that there is also that sort of dehumanizing bent in the 19th century in ways that kind of surprise, I think, Latin Americanists, because so much of the rhetoric had been of inclusion and equality. And yet here we also see this rhetoric of dismissal and derision as well.
Yeah, I'm obviously I'm not a scholar of Peru, but I mean I'm also familiar with that dynamic, how in Cuba the differences with how racism worked, and for example the transformation in terms of how slavery worked in the 19th century compared to both what was before and after has kind of sometimes diluted kind of the way some of these dynamics have been present, and they're the similarities as well. So perfect. Well, I think that our listeners have had an excellent introduction to this topic, and I hope that it inspires them to pick up your book and to look more into this issue and to rethink perhaps how they see, when they read other scholarship and see mentions of clothing and status, how they see that issue. Is there anything else you would like to add?
No, this was a great conversation. Thanks for all your questions.
Oh, thanks for coming on, and I look forward to your future research.
Great, thank you.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.